So good afternoon, everyone. I am Siamak, and I would also like to welcome you to this tutorial. The first session is Introduction to Research Data Management. Let's have a look on the learning objectives. After this session, you will learn about the research data lifecycle. You will become familiar with some recommended data management practices, which can help you to enhance your current and future research. And more importantly, you will understand the logic behind these practices to be able to adapt your own research activities. So this is the contents of this presentation, which is basically answering these three main questions. What is research data management, or RDM? Why is research data management important? And how to implement RDM practices. So let's see what is research data that we are going to manage. Of course, we're all scientists. We deal with data a lot. That's the main output of our scientific activities in the lab and so on. But according to this definition, which is a bit more precise, research data are recorded factual materials used as primary sources for scientific research, and they are commonly accepted in scientific community as necessary to validate research findings or develop scientific hypotheses, models, or theories. There are different examples. For instance, the instrument outputs, what we get in the lab is research data, also the SEM images or in general microscope images are kind of audiovisual information or research data. Codes that scientists develop to do computations or simulations are research data. If you follow some certain procedures to, for instance, test a sample or produce a certain nanomaterial, those procedures is also considered as research data. And based on this definition, finally, the samples themselves are also research data. So traditionally, research data were treated in a more or less linear fashion. So a project started with the planning for the project, and then collection of the necessary data, their analysis, and finally publishing the results. So in this scenario, the focus was mainly on collecting data and their immediate use and publishing the results based on those data. And there was no intention for reuse. So recently, the research paradigms are changing, and data is now being seen as a more valuable and reusable entity. So these data can not only help you for your own project, but maybe in 10 years, they can be beneficial for some other projects. It's a potential. But how to get this potential to be done? We need to preserve the data that we make in the labs and in an organized way to be able to reuse them in a later time. So basically, the new data lifecycle has the same stages as the traditional data lifetime, which is planning, collection, analysis, and sharing, which is almost the same as publication. However, the focus here is more on preservation of the data in an organized way and then later reuse them. That's why here the data management practices come to play and play an important role. But what is research data management? Just have a quick look on these three different situations. Imagine that you're halfway through a project and then suddenly you think, where did I write down that information about that file? Or where is this file that I made some time ago on this sample? Or you find the file and say, is this really the latest version that I have or not? If you face some situation, then you can basically benefit from the research data management. So research data management is the compilation of very small and easy steps to make your data easier to find, easier to understand, less likely to be lost, more likely to be used during your project and later, maybe in 10 years for other projects. So in a more precise definition, research data management is the process of making informed decisions about handling your research data and putting those decisions into action while you are handling them. So why is RDM important? There are some benefits for the researchers. For instance, it prevents potential errors, it saves time and resources in long run, and it can enhance the research quality. Since you're preserving data in an organized way, it's traceable, so it promotes transparency. And for the same reason, it earns reputation and credibility for the researcher. And finally, it can facilitate the knowledge transfer. In addition to these internal interests for the researcher, recently, even research funders or universities, based on their guidelines or publishers, sometimes or most of the times encourage, and some of them even require you to show your RDM practices. as a proof for findings and so on. So let's get to the main part of the tutorial, which is the recommended RDM practices in each step of the data lifecycle. To remember, this is the data lifecycle, and we are going for each stage and see what is important. So the first stage is the planning stage. In the planning stage, all the aspects of the research data management are quite important. That's why an important document, which is called data management plans, or DMPs, are documented at this stage, which address the tools, the procedures, or the way that you handle research data throughout the rest of the stages of the data life cycle. Yeah, so since this is a quite important topic, there is a separate session assigned to this, which starts at around 3 o'clock. It's just important to note that data management plans are living documents. In order to address the challenges that show up during your research, they need to be time to time updated and to meet those challenges, or to be able to answer those challenges. So the second stage of the data lifecycle is data collection. There are basically three main or more important practices here: is metadata documentation, data quality assurance, and use of electronic lab notebooks, or ELNs. So first of all, what is metadata? In layman words, metadata are data about your data, or in a more precise definition, metadata are structured and contextual information that describe, explain, or locate data. But make it easier, let's make it easier. An example, you have a sample, you go to the lab, you do some characterization, you make a data object. Basically, the answer to these questions are your metadata, some of your metadata. So what experiment it is, what instrument did you use, or what was the instrument setting, and so on. The good practice here, or the recommended practice here, is that you should document rich and detailed metadata for your data. But how much detail? It should be as detailed as a person who is in your field, and of course haven't done this experiment, comes and reads your metadata and is able to replicate your work and get the same results as you did. So the next good practice is that, for instance, sometimes you have protocols or procedures. Make sure that you follow each step precisely, and you also understand the logic behind each step. Also be consistent, because it makes that your data are comparable with each other, and they're reproducible and even more reliable. Also try to maintain your instruments and calibrate them regularly. Of course, some instruments don't need regular calibrations, for instance, balances or thermometers. You don't have to care about them. Like, there are some professional calibrations that is done. The university takes care of those. But for other instruments like Raman spectrometers, for instance, we should know what should be calibrated, how should it be calibrated, and when should it be calibrated. For instance, after changing the Raman settings, you need to check if the peak for a standard sample, for instance, a silicon peak, is happening at the same location or same position that you're expecting. So ELNs, or electronic lab notebooks. The ELNs are not just digital versions of the paper notebooks. They offer some advanced functionalities. For instance, they can offer features that ensure data integrity, for instance, by uniform data entry or having timestamps and so on. They can also be connected to databases or to some analytical softwares for you to easier work with your data, or you can also use them to share results or data with your collaborators or team members. But which ELN should you use? Take these four aspects into consideration. First, they should be easy to use. Second, it should be customizable, such that they can meet your needs. You can also play with or customize it to adjust it to do what you want to do. It's good that they have analytics supports, and also look for the recommendation of your community or group. There is a website, ELN Finder, which is a good tool for you to investigate different ELNs and see which one is good for you. And you see other examples of ELNs here. Nomad Oasis, as Ahmed also introduced at the beginning of this presentation, is a solution which is a software which is developed and maintained by FAIRmat. in addition to the several features that it has, it also offers functionalities of an ELN with some very advanced features like specialized data analytics tools. It can be also work with other material science databases, and it's offering a robust support for FAIR data principles. So the third stage is data analysis, and there are two main best practices here. The first one is that document all the steps that you do for processing your data. For instance, if you're doing a background correction or noise reduction or noise canceling or whatever, just document them so that later you know what you have done, and also document the logic behind those. The second best practice is that if you're using computational heavy calculations, it's good to save or to conserve the results, the intermediate results, to later save time if you lose them. And of course, use version control. If it's just easy, by adding a version number at the end of the file, or if it's a more advanced version control like using Git. So the fourth stage is data preservation, which is basically divided into two parts. The short-term data preservation, which is during the project, and the long-term preservation, which is after the project for the archival purposes, for validation purposes. So for the short-term data preservation, we have these three best practices: manage short-term data preservation, data access, which means that you don't want perhaps that everyone has access to your data. So manage the data access for your data for team members, your supervisor, collaborators, and so on. Of course, let's try this practice that we should back up our data regularly and organize data structure. I have a separate slide for this. So the easiest thing that we should try, all of us we should try, is that we organize our data in hierarchical data structure. For instance, for this project, I have experimental data, code, publications, and so on, and other miscellaneous. And then I have this hierarchical structure so that later, if I want to look for a file, I know where to go. There are some recommendations for choosing your file names. For instance, always try to choose a descriptive and content reflective names, so that without going into the file, just by looking at the name, you know what it is or what's the content inside that. Try to be consistent in choosing names, avoid special characters because not all of them are readable in different operating systems. Try to be regex friendly or globe friendly, such that later if you want to look into your files by computer programs, you don't have to really go and click on them yourself, but just do a mass analysis. Include versions if you need. And it's better to have your date format like this, because if you have your date format like this, it's easy to order them based on the name. And this way, either your oldest files comes on top, or sometimes the newest files come on top. So it's always consistent and it works. Again, Nomad, which is developed and maintained by FAIRmat, offers advanced data structure or solutions. For instance, here you can have your data in different file formats, and based on the schema is based on the metadata that you provide. Of course, there are already established schema, and you can also customize them. There are some parsers based on this schema. They go and read your metadata and organize your files into hierarchical structures already. And this can also be integrated with ELNs, such that the ELNs data can also use these schemas and be organized in hierarchical structure as well. So long-term data preservation, we have 4 best practices. The first one is that you should look for the policy that your institute or funder sets. Standard file formats, I'm going to talk about those. Data archives, long-term data access management, all of them will be reviewed in more detail. So as I said, the institutional data policy or your funding agency should or has some guidelines how to treat the data in long term. For instance, the DFG encourages you to save the data at least for 10 years on institutional or cross-location repositories. And if you're not saving some data, for instance, if this is personal data, you should justify already. The same is for Horizon. They have a very open policy. So their motto is as open as possible, as restricted as necessary. So I don't go into more details for the sake of time. So for the standard file formats, there are some recommendations. Pick open and common formats. For instance, the Excel files or the XLS is not very suitable, because if you save an Excel file, later you go home, you want to open it with your Mac, maybe it's not really possible, or later if someone wants to open it. So it's better to use open formats. Avoid instrument-specific or software-specific formats as much as possible. Sometimes it's not possible, but try to archive your data as much as possible in open formats. Also avoid encrypted and compressed proprietary formats. When doing so, make sure that you're not losing metadata. For instance, if you have an image, microscope image, which is TIFF, the TIFF format already has a lot of information, excuse me, metadata inside it. So it's important not to lose those when you're changing this to JPG. So here is a table which shows the list of suggested formats or recommended formats. So there's the archives. Almost every institution offers some solutions for archiving your research data. They are for Berlin universities, but for sure all of the institutes have some solution. You can also benefit from general purpose public repositories, for instance, Zenodo, or for code, GitHub and GitLab. Again, there are some discipline-specific repositories that you can find a list in r3data.org, which is basically a registry of research data repositories. You can just search your discipline and read about different repositories. Again, Nomad offers a repository for material science and physics data, and of course, a lot of other advanced functionalities to work with this data. For instance, you can assign a GUI to cite your data. So long-term data access management, you need to have rules, clear access rules and protocols. You need, for instance, sometimes make your data encrypted. If it's personal data, you should try to use AAI, which is authentication and authorization infrastructure, which is basically defining who is admin, who is able to edit, and who is able to only view your files. You should also apply embargoes, for instance, before publications, when you want to keep some data not published until the paper or your publication is published, and then basically publish the data, maybe open access. There's two best practices for data sharing stage, which is licensing and PIDs. So for licensings, it's important to note that you license the research outputs with Creative Commons. It's the most used license for research outputs, but for code, they are not, the Creative Commons license is not useful. It's better to decide for copyleft or more permissive licenses. So again, about the Creative Commons licenses, let's just talk about the take-home messages. They are the most widely used licenses for research outputs. They're not useful for code. You can decide based on the permission that you give for commercial use. For derivative works, means that if anyone is able to build upon your work or not. And you can decide on the licensing of the derivative works. There are basically three licenses in Creative Commons, these three, which are in alignment with the open access policy. And the CC BY is the most used one. Let's have a quick look on these symbols. So CC stands for Creative Commons. 0 means that the content which is symboled with 0 is that it has 0 copyright or no rights is reserved. If you see by, just ask yourself, the work was done by who? It means that it should give credit to the author. If you see SA, which means share alike, means that share the derivative work with alike or similar license. If you see NC, it's standing for non-commercial, so it's there for non-commercial use only. ND means that there is the derivatives or extra works that you make built upon that work is not allowed. Basically, you're not allowed to make derivatives of the work. And with that, we can easily read this license. It's a CC license. I should credit the author. It's for non-commercial use only, and share alike. When I'm sharing the results or the work, I should assign a similar license for the work. So as I said, for code, we use other licenses. It's just enough that you remember that there are the 4 main licenses used for open source code, GPL, LGPL, MIT, and Apache 2. The MIT is the mostly used. It allows everyone to do anything with your code. These 2, GPL and LGPL, are copyleft. It means that if a person comes and builds upon your code or uses your code, the software or the code that he or she makes should also stay free. They cannot commercialize it. And and they're ordered here based on the degree of their permissiveness. So what are persistent identifiers? Imagine that you have a data and you want to share it with collaborators. Of course, you upload it on a repository. It's not a good practice to just send the URL or address of the title bar of the browser to the person. Why? Because the repository may change their structure and so on, and you may face an error, this 404, the page that you're looking is not found anymore. So what's the solution? Assign persistent identifiers. So what are PIDs? They are pointers to the various type of resources like data, metadata, or documents. They are globally unique. They have infinite lifespan. They're forever there, and they can also be resolved to resources. You already know some examples. For instance, you know about DUIs for the papers, ISBN for the books, PURLs or persistent URLs, or ORCID ID of a scientist, and so on. And finally, there are 3 best practices for data reuse, which is always check for license, see if you're able to use those data or not. Check if the data is compatible with the other data that you're using, if the quality meets what you require or not, and always cite properly. With this, I get to the summary of this part of the tutorial.